The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine corridors of Kensington Palace as Sarah Mitchell hurried toward her office, clutching a steaming cup of tea. As the Princess of Wales's personal secretary for 3 years, Sarah had witnessed many behind-the-scenes moments, but nothing had prepared her for what she would overhear that Tuesday morning in March. Sarah had always prided herself on her discretion. Working for Catherine, the Princess of Wales, required absolute loyalty and the ability to keep royal secrets locked away. The position came with prestige, excellent benefits, and the constant reminder that one wrong move could destroy not just her career, but potentially damage the monarchy itself. That particular morning, Sarah arrived earlier than usual to prepare for Catherine's busy schedule. The princess had back-to-back meetings with charity representatives followed by a planning session for an upcoming royal tour. As Sarah organized the day's documents in the outer office, she heard voices drifting from Catherine's private study. The conversation was clearly heated. Though the voices remained controlled in that distinctly royal manner, Sarah recognized Catherine's voice immediately. But it took her a moment to identify the second speaker as Queen Camilla. The two women were discussing arrangements for an upcoming state dinner, but the tone suggested underlying tensions that went far beyond menu selections and seating charts. Sarah tried to focus on her work, arranging folders and checking emails, but the voices grew more distinct as the conversation intensified. She found herself frozen at her desk, unable to move without potentially drawing attention to her presence in the adjacent room. "I simply cannot understand why protocol must always bend to accommodate her preferences." Catherine's voice carried a sharp edge that Sarah had never heard before. "The constant changes, the last-minute demands, it's becoming impossible to manage." Camilla's response was measured but firm. "Catherine, dear, experience teaches us that flexibility in these matters often serves the crown better than rigid adherence to outdated traditions. Perhaps if you approach these situations with more understanding." The words that followed would later become the center of a scandal that would rock the British royal family. Sarah heard Catherine's voice rise slightly, the careful royal composure slipping just enough to reveal genuine frustration. "Understanding. I understand perfectly well that some people mistake being queen consort for being the actual queen. The presumption is quite remarkable, actually. One would think that someone who waited so long for the role might show more grace in executing it." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah felt her heart pounding as she realized the gravity of what she had just heard. The Princess of Wales had effectively questioned Queen Camilla's legitimacy and criticized her approach to royal duties in terms that could only be described as insulting. Sarah remained motionless, barely breathing, as she heard footsteps approaching the door. Queen Camilla emerged first, her expression carefully neutral but her posture radiating tension. She nodded briefly to Sarah before continuing down the corridor, her heels clicking authoritatively against the polished floors. Moments later, Catherine appeared in the doorway, her usually composed features showing signs of strain. She glanced at Sarah, and for a brief moment their eyes met. Something in the princess's expression suggested she knew her conversation had been overheard. But neither woman acknowledged the situation directly. "Sarah, please postpone this morning's charity meeting by 30 minutes, Catherine said, her voice returning to its normal, controlled tone. "I need a few moments to review some documents." As Catherine retreated back into her study, Sarah sat in stunned silence, trying to process what she had witnessed. The implications were staggering. The Princess of Wales had essentially accused the Queen Consort of overstepping her role and lacking the grace befitting her position. In royal circles, such comments could be considered deeply inappropriate, if not outright disrespectful. Sarah had always admired Catherine's dedication to her royal duties and her genuine care for the causes she championed. The princess had shown her nothing but kindness and professionalism throughout their working relationship. But the woman she had just overheard seemed different, frustrated, perhaps overwhelmed by the pressures of royal life and the complex dynamics within the family. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of rescheduled appointments and tense phone calls. Sarah noticed that Catherine seemed distracted during her meetings, her usual warmth and engagement replaced by a more formal, distant demeanor. The charity representatives who had traveled from across the country to meet with the princess left looking slightly puzzled by her subdued reception. As the day wore on, Sarah found herself struggling with an impossible dilemma. Her loyalty to Catherine was absolute, but she also understood the potential consequences if word of the morning's conversation were to leak. The British press would have a field day with such revelations, and the damage to both Catherine's reputation and the monarchy's stability could be severe. Sarah had signed multiple confidentiality agreements when she began working for the royal family, agreements that carried serious legal and financial penalties for violations. But she also knew that in the interconnected world of palace staff, secrets rarely remained buried for long. Kitchen staff talked to housekeeping chatted with security, and eventually, information found its way to the outside world. By evening, as Sarah finally prepared to leave the palace, she felt as though she was carrying an enormous weight. The knowledge of what she had heard seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour, and she found herself wondering how long she could keep such explosive information to herself. The irony wasn't lost on her that she, a woman who had dedicated her career to protecting royal privacy, now possessed information that could potentially damage the very institution she served. As she walked through the palace gates and into the London evening, Sarah Mitchell had no idea that her life was about to change forever, and that the conversation she had overheard would soon become the most talked about royal scandal in recent memory. 3 weeks had passed since the confrontation between Catherine and Camilla, and Sarah Mitchell found herself living in a constant state of anxiety. The secret she carried felt like a ticking time bomb, growing more dangerous with each passing day. Despite her best efforts to maintain normalcy, the knowledge of what she had witnessed was beginning to affect every aspect of her life. The palace atmosphere had grown noticeably tense in recent days. Sarah observed subtle changes in the daily routines that suggested all was not well within the royal household. Catherine's schedule had been mysteriously altered to minimize overlap with Queen Camilla's activities. State dinners that would normally feature both women were being carefully choreographed to limit their interaction time. Sarah noticed how the other staff members moved through the corridors with increased caution, speaking in hushed tones and avoiding lingering conversations. The usual easy camaraderie among the palace workers had been replaced by an air of uncertainty that seemed to permeate every corner of Kensington Palace. During this period, Sarah began to notice increased attention from unexpected sources. James Crawford, a veteran reporter known for his royal family coverage, had somehow obtained her personal phone number and had been leaving increasingly persistent messages. His voicemail started politely, requesting a brief conversation about her experiences working with the Princess of Wales, but gradually became more pointed in their inquiries. "Miss Mitchell, I understand you're in a unique position to provide insight into recent developments within the royal household," his latest message had said. "I believe there are stories that deserve to be told, and I'd very much like to speak with you about your perspective on current events." Sarah deleted each message immediately, but the reporter's persistence was unnerving. How had he gotten her number? More importantly, what did he know about the situation, and how had he identified her as someone worth pursuing? The pressure intensified when Sarah received an unexpected visit from her younger sister Emma, who lived in Manchester and rarely made trips to London. Emma arrived at Sarah's flat one evening with wine and takeaway food, claiming she wanted to catch up, but her true purpose became clear within minutes. "Sarah, I've been reading some interesting things online about tensions in the royal family," Emma said, settling onto the sofa with her wine glass. "There are rumors about disagreements between Catherine and Camilla. You work so closely with the princess, surely you must have some insight into what's really happening." Sarah felt her stomach drop. If casual speculation was already circulating online, it was only a matter of time before more serious investigations began. She deflected Emma's questions as skillfully as she could, but she could see her sister's journalistic instincts awakening. Emma worked as a freelance writer and had always been skilled at sensing when someone was hiding something significant. "I respect confidentiality agreements, Emma. You know that," Sarah replied carefully. "My job requires absolute discretion, and I take that responsibility very seriously." But Emma wasn't easily deterred. "Of course, but surely you can tell family if something major is brewing. I'm not asking you to break any laws, just sisterly concern, you know?" The conversation left Sarah feeling even more isolated. She realized that the burden of keeping the secret was affecting her relationships with everyone in her life. She was becoming paranoid, analyzing every conversation for hidden meanings and potential threats to her position. At work, Sarah found herself studying Catherine's behavior for signs of stress or regret about the confrontation. The princess maintained her public composure admirably, but Sarah detected subtle changes in her demeanor. Catherine seemed more guarded in her interactions with staff, more formal in her communications, and noticeably more tired despite maintaining her usual packed schedule. During a particularly challenging day coordinating a charity event, Catherine made an offhand comment that sent chills down Sarah's spine. "Sarah, I hope you understand how much I value loyalty," the princess said while reviewing event programs. "In this position, surrounded by so many people, it's sometimes difficult to know who can truly be trusted." The comment seemed innocent enough, but something in Catherine's tone suggested deeper meaning. Was this a subtle warning? Did the princess suspect that their private conversation had been overheard? Sarah managed a professional response, but her hands trembled slightly as she organized the documents. The breaking point came when Sarah discovered that her personal laptop had been tampered with. She arrived home one evening to find subtle signs that someone had been in her flat. A chair moved slightly, books rearranged on her coffee table, and most alarmingly, her laptop positioned differently than she remembered leaving it. A quick check of her browser history revealed searches she hadn't conducted, all related to royal family news and recent speculation about internal conflicts. Someone had been looking for information on her computer, presumably hoping to find evidence of communications with journalists or other compromising materials. Sarah immediately called the building's security office, but they had no record of any maintenance visits or authorized entries to her unit. The realization that unknown individuals had accessed her private space sent waves of panic through her. If people were willing to break into her home, the situation was far more serious than she had imagined. That night, Sarah lay awake weighing her increasingly limited options. She could continue keeping the secret, hoping that the situation would eventually blow over. But the growing pressure suggested that discovery was inevitable. Alternatively, she could proactively control the narrative by carefully sharing information with a trusted journalist, potentially protecting herself from future accusations of betrayal. The third option, reporting the break-in to police and potentially involving palace security, seemed equally dangerous. Such action would almost certainly trigger an internal investigation that could expose her knowledge of the confrontation between Catherine and Camilla. As dawn broke over London, Sarah Mitchell realized that her comfortable, secure life as a trusted royal employee was ending. Whether she chose to act or not, the forces already in motion seemed beyond her control, and she could only hope to navigate the coming storm with her reputation and livelihood intact. The irony wasn't lost on her that in her effort to protect the royal family's privacy, she had become a threat to the very institution she had devoted her career to serving. The decision that would change everything came on a rainy Thursday morning in April. Sarah Mitchell sat in a small cafe near Victoria Station, nervously stirring her coffee as she waited for James Crawford, the persistent royal correspondent who had been trying to reach her for weeks. After the break-in at her flat and mounting pressure from multiple directions, she had finally agreed to meet with him. Crawford arrived precisely on time, a tall man in his 50s with graying hair and the weathered appearance of someone who had spent decades chasing difficult stories. He ordered tea and settled into the booth across from Sarah, his expression both professional and sympathetic. "Miss Mitchell, I appreciate you agreeing to meet with me," he began, pulling out a small recording device and placing it on the table between them. "Before we begin, I want you to understand that I'm not here to destroy anyone's career or damage the royal family. My goal is simply to ensure that the public has access to truthful information about the people who represent them." Sarah stared at the recording device, knowing that once she began speaking, there would be no turning back. "I need your word that my identity will be protected," she said quietly. "I've dedicated my career to serving the royal family, and despite everything that's happened, I don't want to be seen as someone who betrayed their trust." Crawford nodded solemnly. "I can protect your identity to the extent that the law allows, but you should understand that if this story gains significant traction, there may be pressure to reveal sources. I can't make guarantees beyond my own professional ethics." For the next hour, Sarah carefully recounted the conversation she had overheard between Catherine and Camilla. She spoke slowly and deliberately, choosing her words carefully to convey the substance of what she had heard, without embellishing or adding her own interpretations. Crawford listened intently, occasionally asking for clarification, but mostly allowing her to tell the story in her own way. When Princess Catherine said that some people mistake being queen consort for being the actual queen, her tone was unmistakably critical, Sarah explained, and the comment about presumption and grace, it was clearly directed at Queen Camilla personally, not just at the situation they were discussing. Crawford took detailed notes while the recorder captured every word. "Had you ever witnessed tension between them before this incident?" he asked. Sarah considered the question carefully. There had been subtle signs, scheduling conflicts that seemed intentional, different approaches to certain royal protocols, but nothing this direct or personal. This conversation felt like the culmination of underlying frustrations that had been building for some time. After the interview concluded, Crawford assured Sarah that he would verify the information through other sources before publishing anything. He explained his process of checking details, seeking corroborating evidence, and ensuring that the story met journalistic standards for accuracy and public interest. "I expect this story to run early next week," he told her as they prepared to leave. "I'd recommend that you prepare for increased scrutiny once it's published. The palace will almost certainly launch an investigation to identify the source of the information." Sarah returned to work that afternoon with a mixture of relief and dread. The secret that had been consuming her life was finally out of her hands, but she knew that the consequences were only beginning. She went through the motions of her daily responsibilities, organizing Catherine's schedule and coordinating with various royal departments, all while knowing that her time in this role was likely coming to an end. That evening, Sarah called her sister Emma to warn her about the upcoming story. "There's going to be a news article about the royal family early next week that might generate some attention," she said carefully. "If any reporters contact you asking about me, please don't discuss our family or my work." Emma's excitement was immediate and obvious. "Sarah, are you involved in this somehow? This sounds like a major story. You have to tell me what's happening." "I can't discuss it, but I wanted you to be prepared for possible media attention," Sarah replied. "Please promise me you'll be careful about what you say to anyone who might contact you." The weekend passed slowly, with Sarah alternating between relief at having shared her burden and terror about the potential consequences. She found herself constantly checking news websites and social media, looking for any early hints that the story might break sooner than expected. Monday morning brought an unusual atmosphere to Kensington Palace. Sarah arrived to find increased security presence and several unfamiliar faces in administrative offices. The palace communication team, normally a small and efficient group, had been reinforced with additional staff members, who moved through the corridors with the purposeful urgency of people preparing for crisis. Management Catherine's schedule had been mysteriously cleared for the entire morning, with all meetings postponed until the afternoon. When Sarah knocked on the princess's study door to deliver the day's correspondence, she found Catherine in discussion with two men in expensive suits who were clearly not part of the regular palace staff. "Sarah, please hold all calls this morning unless they're absolutely urgent," Catherine said, her voice carrying a tension that Sarah had rarely heard before. "I'll let you know when I'm available for the day's regular business." As Sarah retreated to her office, she couldn't help but wonder if the palace had somehow learned about her meeting with Crawford. The timing seemed too coincidental, and the increased security presence suggested that someone expected trouble in the very near future. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Crawford. "Story confirmed for tomorrow's front page. Suggest you take some personal time over the next few days." Sarah stared at the message, realizing that in less than 24 hours, her carefully guarded secret would become front-page news across the United Kingdom. The conversation she had overheard between two of the most prominent women in the royal family would soon be analyzed, debated and dissected by millions of people. That afternoon, as Sarah organized files and prepared correspondence, she caught glimpses of urgent phone calls and hushed conferences happening throughout the palace. The calm, orderly environment she had known for 3 years was rapidly transforming into something that felt more like a war room than a royal residence. By evening, as Sarah prepared to leave what might be her final day as the Princess of Wales's secretary, she reflected on how quickly her stable, prestigious career had unraveled. The conversation she had overheard, which had lasted less than 10 minutes, was about to trigger a scandal that would dominate headlines and potentially reshape public perception of the royal family. Tuesday morning arrived with the explosive headline that Sarah had been dreading. Royal rift exposed. Kate's shocking insults to Queen Camilla. Revealed by Palace Insider. The story dominated the front page of 3 major newspapers and was trending across every social media platform within hours of publication. Sarah Mitchell had called in sick to work, unable to face the inevitable chaos at Kensington Palace. Instead, she sat in her flat, watching the story unfold across television news programs and online platforms. Every major news network was covering the scandal, with royal experts and commentators dissecting every word of the reported conversation between Catherine and Camilla. The article, written by James Crawford with meticulous attention to detail, quoted the conversation extensively while protecting Sarah's identity as promised. However, the piece provided enough context about the source's position and access to make it clear that the information had come from someone very close to the Princess of Wales. According to a highly placed source within the princess's immediate staff, the article read, Catherine questioned Queen Camilla's understanding of her role, suggesting that some people mistake being queen consort for being the actual queen and criticizing what she termed presumption in the queen consort's approach to royal duties. The public reaction was immediate and divided. Social media exploded with competing hashtags. Team Kate and Time Stand with Camilla began trending within hours. Royal supporters were split between those who viewed Catherine's comments as an understandable expression of frustration and those who considered them disrespectful and inappropriate. For someone in her position, Sarah's phone had been ringing constantly since early morning, with calls from numbers she didn't recognize and reporters who had somehow obtained her personal information, despite Crawford's promise to protect her identity. She had turned off her landline and put her mobile on silent, but the constant vibration of incoming calls served as a reminder that her anonymity was rapidly disappearing. The palace's response came in the form of a carefully worded statement released by the communications office. The royal family does not comment on private conversations or unsubstantiated claims made by anonymous sources. The Princess of Wales and Queen Camilla continue to work together effectively in service of their majesties and the British people. However, the formal denial was undermined by obvious signs of crisis management. Television footage showed increased security around royal residences, and several scheduled public appearances by both Catherine and Camilla were quietly postponed without explanation. The annual garden party at Buckingham Palace, which would typically feature both women prominently, was suddenly restructured to minimize their joint appearances. Royal commentator Victoria Hartwell appeared on the BBC's morning program to analyze the implications of the scandal. What we're seeing here is potentially the most serious internal conflict within the royal family since the Diana years, she explained to viewers. The reported comments go beyond typical family disagreements and suggest fundamental differences about roles, authority, and protocol that could have lasting consequences for the monarchy. Sarah watched these discussions with growing horror, realizing that her decision to speak with Crawford had unleashed forces far beyond her control. What had started as a personal dilemma about keeping a secret had evolved into a national conversation about royal hierarchy, family dynamics, and the future of the monarchy itself. By afternoon, the story had gone international. American networks were covering the Kate versus Camilla conflict as their lead entertainment story, while European media outlets analyzed the potential constitutional implications of public discord within the royal family. The scandal was being compared to historical royal controversies, with some commentators suggesting it represented the most significant internal crisis for the monarchy since the abdication crisis of 1936. Sarah's doorbell rang at around 3 o'clock, and she peered through the peephole to see 2 women in business suits standing outside her flat. One held an official-looking envelope while the other appeared to be taking notes. Sarah recognized them as palace security personnel, probably accompanied by someone from the legal department. She didn't answer the door, but the women waited outside for nearly an hour, occasionally speaking into radio devices and making phone calls. The message was clear. The palace had identified her as the source of the leak, and they were beginning to take formal action. That evening, Sarah received a registered letter that had been delivered to her building's management office. The letter on official Kensington Palace letterhead informed her that her employment was suspended pending a full investigation into breaches of confidentiality. She was instructed not to contact any members of the royal household or attempt to enter palace grounds until further notice. The letter also reminded her of the legal and financial penalties associated with violating her confidentiality agreements, penalties that could include substantial monetary damages and potential criminal charges for breaching official secrets. Reading the formal language of potential prosecution, Sarah felt her stomach turn as she realized the full extent of the trouble she might be facing. Her sister Emma called that evening, having seen the news coverage and pieced together Sarah's involvement. "Sarah, please tell me you had nothing to do with this story," she said, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "I can't discuss it, Em," Sarah replied wearily. "I'm sorry, but I really can't talk about any of this right now." "You need a lawyer," Emma said bluntly. "This is serious, Sarah. The palace doesn't play games when it comes to protecting their reputation. If you're involved in this, you need professional legal advice immediately." After ending the call, Sarah sat in her darkened flat, watching news anchors and royal experts continue to dissect every aspect of the story she had set in motion. The reported conversation was being analyzed from every possible angle, with body language experts, royal historians, and constitutional scholars all weighing in on its significance. What struck Sarah most was how quickly the story had evolved beyond the simple facts of what she had overheard. The narrative had taken on a life of its own, with speculation about deeper conflicts, power struggles, and the future dynamics of the royal family. The 10-minute conversation between Catherine and Camilla had become the foundation for countless theories about jealousy, ambition, and the challenges of modern monarchy. As the night wore on, Sarah realized that there was no going back to her old life. Whether she faced legal consequences or not, her career in royal service was over. The trust that had taken years to build had been destroyed in a single moment of decision, and the scandal she had helped create would likely follow her for the rest of her life. The woman who had dedicated her career to protecting royal privacy had become the most talked-about palace insider in recent memory, and the weight of that irony was almost unbearable. 3 days after the story broke, Sarah Mitchell found herself sitting in a solicitor's office in central London, facing the harsh reality of her legal situation. Margaret Thornton, a specialist in employment law and media disputes, had agreed to represent her after Emma had insisted that Sarah needed immediate professional help. "Miss Mitchell, I need to be direct with you about the challenges we're facing," Margaret said, reviewing the palace's legal documentation. "The confidentiality agreements you signed are extremely comprehensive, and the penalties for breach are severe. We're looking at potential damages in the hundreds of thousands of pounds, plus possible criminal charges under the Official Secrets Act." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. "Criminal charges? But I didn't reveal state secrets or anything that could harm national security. It was just a private conversation between family members." Margaret shook her head grimly. "The royal family's communications are treated differently under British law. The palace legal team will argue that your revelation of private royal discussions constitutes a breach of official confidentiality, regardless of the content. They have broad legal powers to protect royal privacy, and they're clearly prepared to use them." While Sarah grappled with her legal troubles, the scandal continued to dominate British media and public discourse. The story had evolved beyond the initial revelation, with new details and analysis appearing daily. Royal watchers were dissecting every public appearance by Catherine and Camilla, looking for signs of ongoing tension or attempts at reconciliation. The most damaging development came when additional sources began speaking to the media. Other palace staff members, emboldened by the initial revelation, started sharing their own observations about tensions within the royal household. A former housekeeper spoke anonymously about frosty exchanges between the two women, while a protocol officer described unusual scheduling requests designed to minimize their joint appearances. These additional revelations transformed the story from a single incident into evidence of a broader pattern of conflict. Media outlets began referring to a palace civil war and speculating about the long-term stability of royal family relationships. The narrative had grown far beyond what Sarah had intended when she first spoke to James Crawford. Public opinion remained sharply divided. Polling conducted by major newspapers showed that younger respondents were more likely to support Catherine, viewing her as a modernizing force challenging outdated hierarchies. Older respondents tended to support Camilla, seeing the queen consort as deserving of respect regardless of personal feelings. The division extended to social media, where Kate vs. Camilla became one of the most contentious topics of the year. Supporters of both women created elaborate theories about their motivations and shared carefully selected photos and video clips to support their preferred narrative. Fan accounts that had previously celebrated royal unity now found themselves choosing sides in an increasingly bitter online conflict. The international media attention intensified when American television host Oprah Winfrey announced that she was seeking interviews with sources close to the royal family about the ongoing tensions. The announcement sent shockwaves through the palace, as royal officials remembered the devastating impact of Winfrey's previous interview with Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. Palace Communications Director Sir Marcus Whitfield held an emergency briefing with senior staff, emphasizing the need for absolute discretion in the face of increased media pressure. According to sources who attended the meeting, Sir Marcus described the current situation as the most serious threat to royal reputation management in recent memory, and warned that any further leaks would result in immediate dismissal and legal action. Meanwhile, Sarah found herself essentially under siege in her own flat. Photographers camped outside her building, hoping to capture images of the mysterious palace insider whose revelations had triggered the scandal. She had been forced to shop for groceries at unusual hours and use building service entrance to avoid the constant media presence. The stress began affecting her health. Sarah developed insomnia and lost weight as anxiety consumed her daily life. Her savings were being rapidly depleted by legal fees, and job prospects in her field had evaporated overnight. No other members of the royal household would consider hiring someone who had been involved in such a high-profile breach of confidentiality. Emma visited regularly, bringing groceries and moral support, but their conversations were strained by the magnitude of the crisis Sarah was facing. "I never imagined it would become this big," Sarah confided during one of these visits. "I thought I was just sharing information about a single conversation, not triggering a national scandal." The turning point came when James Crawford, the journalist who had first published Sarah's revelations, received a legal notice from the palace demanding that he reveal his source's identity. Crawford's newspaper, the Daily Herald, issued a statement declaring their commitment to protecting journalistic sources, but Sarah knew that legal pressure could eventually force disclosure. Margaret Thornton delivered more troubling news during their weekly meeting. "The palace is escalating their legal strategy," she reported. "They're now arguing that the breach of confidentiality has caused measurable damage to the royal family's reputation and public standing. They're seeking not just damages for contract violation, but additional compensation for reputational harm." The financial implications were staggering. Beyond the immediate legal costs, Sarah could potentially face a lifetime of debt if the palace succeeded in proving that her revelations had damaged the monarchy's standing. The irony wasn't lost on her that her attempt to relieve the burden of keeping a secret had created a much heavier burden that might never be lifted. As the scandal entered its second week, royal commentators began speculating about possible resolution strategies. Some suggested that a public reconciliation between Catherine and Camilla might help contain the damage, while others argued that only time would allow the controversy to fade from public attention. However, new developments suggested that the conflict was far from over. Reports emerged of canceled joint engagements and restructured official events designed to minimize interaction between the two women. The upcoming coronation anniversary celebration, which would typically feature extensive cooperation between Catherine and Camilla, was reportedly being redesigned to accommodate their apparent unwillingness to work closely together. Sarah watched these developments with a mixture of fascination and horror, realizing that her decision to speak with Crawford had set in motion forces that were reshaping one of Britain's most important institutions. The conversation she had overheard between Catherine and Camilla had become the catalyst for a crisis that was affecting everything from constitutional protocol to international diplomatic relationships. As she prepared for sleep in her besieged flat, Sarah reflected on how completely her life had changed in just 2 weeks. and wondered whether she would ever find a way to rebuild from the ruins of her former existence. 6 months after the scandal broke, Sarah Mitchell stood in a small cottage garden in the Cotswolds, finally breathing freely for the first time since that fateful morning when she overheard the conversation that changed everything. The legal settlement with the palace had been reached 3 weeks earlier, bringing an end to the most challenging period of her life. The resolution had come through unexpected channels. Princess Catherine herself had intervened in the legal proceedings, reportedly telling palace lawyers that she wanted to move forward rather than pursue punishment. The final settlement required Sarah to pay a substantial but manageable fine, sign additional confidentiality agreements about future royal matters, and accept a permanent ban from royal employment. In exchange, the palace agreed to provide a neutral employment reference that would allow Sarah to rebuild her career outside royal service. More importantly, they agreed not to pursue criminal charges under the Official Secrets Act, a concession that Margaret Thornton described as surprisingly generous given the circumstances. The scandal itself had gradually faded from front-page news, though it continued to influence royal family dynamics in subtle but significant ways. Catherine and Camilla had eventually appeared together at several public events, displaying professional courtesy that satisfied protocol requirements while maintaining a noticeable emotional distance. Royal watchers noted that the two women's working relationship had evolved into a carefully choreographed arrangement that minimized conflict while avoiding the appearance of friendship. Joint appearances were limited to essential state functions, and their separate charitable endeavors rarely overlapped. The palace had effectively institutionalized the distance between them, creating parallel spheres of influence that allowed both women to operate without direct confrontation. Sarah had used her settlement period to complete a degree in public relations, funded partly by an unexpected source. James Crawford, the journalist who had published her revelations, had quietly arranged for her to receive several freelance writing opportunities that helped supplement her income during the legal proceedings. "You showed courage in speaking out about something that needed to be addressed," Crawford told her during one of their occasional meetings. "The public had a right to know about the tensions affecting their royal family, and you helped provide that transparency." Sarah wasn't entirely comfortable with Crawford's framing of her actions as journalistic heroism, but she appreciated his ongoing support during her darkest months. The writing work had given her a new career direction and helped her rebuild confidence that had been shattered by the scandal. The cottage she now rented belonged to a retired civil servant who had followed the scandal with sympathetic interest. Eleanor Pemberton had offered Sarah the small guest house on her property at a reduced rent, providing not just affordable housing but also the rural isolation Sarah needed to escape ongoing media attention. "My dear, we've all made mistakes in service to institutions we believed in," Eleanor had said when Sarah first visited the property. "The important thing is learning to live with the consequences while building something better for the future." Sarah's relationship with her sister Emma had been complicated by the scandal's aftermath. Emma had initially been excited by the proximity to such a major news story, but she gradually came to understand the personal cost Sarah had paid for her moment of revelation. Their conversations had become more honest and supportive as Emma witnessed her sister's struggles with anxiety, financial stress, and professional uncertainty. "I'm proud of you for surviving all this," Emma told Sarah during a recent visit to the cottage. "You made a difficult decision in an impossible situation, and you've handled the consequences with more grace than most people could manage." The broader impact of Sarah's revelations continued to resonate within royal circles and British society. Constitutional experts had used the scandal as a starting point for discussions about transparency in modern monarchy, arguing that the public had legitimate interests in understanding the dynamics of the institution they financially supported. Several books about the scandal had been published, with varying degrees of accuracy and insight. Sarah had been approached by multiple publishers seeking to tell her side of the story, but her settlement agreement with the palace severely limited what she could legally discuss. She had declined all such offers, preferring to maintain the privacy she had fought to regain. The royal family itself had emerged from the scandal with their public standing largely intact, though opinion polling showed increased skepticism about their internal relationships among younger demographic groups. The monarchy's institutional stability had proved remarkably resilient. absorbing the shock of Sarah's revelations and adapting to continue functioning effectively. Catherine and Camilla had both seen their individual approval ratings recover from the immediate aftermath of the scandal. Catherine's supporters viewed her comments as evidence of her passionate commitment to royal duty, while Camilla's supporters respected her dignified response to public criticism. The division between their fan bases persisted, but it had evolved into a manageable rivalry rather than destructive conflict. As Sarah tended to her small garden on this peaceful autumn morning, she reflected on the lessons she had learned from her experience. The impulse to share burdensome secrets was understandable, but the consequences of such revelations could extend far beyond personal relief. Institutions like the royal family were more fragile and more resilient than they appeared, capable of absorbing serious damage while adapting to protect their essential functions. She had come to understand that her role in the scandal was more complex than simple betrayal or heroic truth-telling. She had been an ordinary person caught in extraordinary circumstances, making imperfect decisions under tremendous pressure. The judgment of history would depend on perspectives she couldn't control and factors she couldn't predict. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from Margaret Thornton, her former lawyer who had become something approaching a friend during their months of working together. Saw the photos from the latest royal engagement. Both women looked professional and composed. Your courage in speaking out may have ultimately forced them to find a workable arrangement. Looking back at the cottage where she was building a new life, Sarah realized that she had found something she hadn't expected in the aftermath of the scandal. Peace. Not the peace of having made the right decision. She would never be certain about that, but the peace of having survived the consequences of a choice made under impossible circumstances. The conversation she had overheard between Catherine and Camilla would continue to be analyzed and debated by royal watchers and historians. But for Sarah Mitchell, it had become simply part of her personal history. She had been the palace secretary who heard too much, said too much, and somehow found a way to rebuild her life from the wreckage of her former existence.